want to transition a little bit. So,
Sure.
you work at City College, and Uptown Manhattan it's a very interesting place on earth because it has some of the most poverty-stricken people in proximity to some of the wealthiest people.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, like, what does Stoicism give us, or what tools can philosophy give us in creating a more equitable society?
Excellent question. So the Stoics tend to be, well, actually, they don't tend to be, they are cosmopolitan, meaning that they think that all of humanity is just one big family where we're all uncles and brothers and sisters and whatever it is, and that we should act accordingly. So it doesn't matter if somebody's from your neighborhood or from the other side of the world. It doesn't matter whether somebody's a man or a woman or any other gender. Nothing matters. It doesn't matter what their ethnicity is. It doesn't matter what their nationality certainly is. You ought to treat them as if they were your brothers and sisters. So that is a blueprint for a cosmopolitan society. A cosmopolitan society is a just society because you have no reason to treat people in a differential way. Mm-hmm. Right? Everybody should have the same kind of opportunities. Everybody should have the same kind of access to resources and things like that. Of course, that's the ideal, right? But you do need an ideal. If you don't have an ideal, the ideal is the end point, right? If you don't have an end point in mind, then you don't know where you're going. Now, from a practical perspective, for instance, that means that Stoics are in favor of abolishing national boundaries.
So
right?
No borders.
No borders, right? Now, that doesn't mean overnight, because Stoics tend to be very practical. And so they realize that if you did that overnight, it would be chaos. It would be just it'd be not a good situation. But again, ideally, that's where you want to go. And so Stoics would, for instance, favor broader and broader coalition of states, like the European Union, for instance. That is a project that a Stoic can get on board. If you travel through Europe, I have occasionally traveled with some friends, or more often with my wife, who is American, and they're always surprised because we moved from Italy to France to Germany, and they never asked a passport.
No problem.
Right? There's no problem. It's like going from Alabama to Georgia. It doesn't matter, right? That's what ideally a Stoic would want globally. And so a Stoic, so in terms of practical political things, as a Stoic, I favor every kind of project along those lines. So I'm very much in favor of the European Union, and I don't like, on the other hand, I'm against nationalistic kind of projects. When I see people saying, no, we need to curve our little independent state because we don't like those people and want to do things differently, I think to myself, that's a step in the wrong direction. So there is a general, so that's just an example of how there is a general ideal, cosmopolitanism. We're not there, and we're likely not going to get there for some time. However, there is also very clear political steps you take. So that means, if you're a cosmopolitan, that means you're in favor of eventually abolishing national boundaries, which means you're in favor of all sorts of policies, not only institutions like the European Union, but, for instance, having more and more lax immigration laws, right? That sort of stuff. You should, from a cosmopolitan perspective, you should make immigration as easy as possible. Again, you're not being naive. You understand that right now there are complications, there are limits to these kind of things. It has to be done, gradually by steps. But I'm in favor of as broad and as easy immigration laws as possible, for instance.
I feel like that process would take a very long time, especially here.
That is true, but I do believe I'm a little bit of an optimist in the long term about things. In the short term, I'm a pessimist. I think, for instance, that the United States is facing a really horrible electoral choice at the presidential elections coming up in a few months. So in the immediate, I'm not very optimistic. But I think in the long run, we have made some progress. I can give you examples of what I think are clear examples of moral progress. For instance, the abolition of slavery. Right. Slavery was universal in the ancient world. Right? Any empire not just the Romans and the Greeks, but the Chinese, the Egyptians, everybody, the Mayans, anybody everywhere had slaves. All the world economy basically ran on slavery. Eventually, we abolished it. It's not there anymore. There are, complications. There are pockets. But by and large, you don't see people going around defending slavery, and certainly you don't see governments going around defending slavery. So that to me is an example of clear progress. It took thousands of years, literally thousands of years, right? But it's progress. More recently, we have progress over, enfranchisement of more and more people, right? Women's vote, first, at the beginning of the 20th century. I mean, we tend to forget that. Women in the United States only got the vote almost 100 years ago.
It's crazy.
Less than, because 1925. Wow. So it's like, that's crazy. We take it for granted these days, but it's pretty crazy. And of course, other minorities have achieved progress even more recently, right? I mean, I have actually seen with my own eyes, let's say, LGBTQ minority, status going from no way this is ever going to happen to, it's pretty normal. There are major pockets of resistance, as you know, but it's happened. Legislation has been passed at a federal level and as well as at the level of several states that was unthinkable 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. Right? So I think that's progress. Now, unfortunately, unlike Martin Luther King, I don't believe that the moral arc of the universe goes anywhere. It doesn't bend anywhere. He says famously that it bends toward justice. I don't think there is a moral arc of the universe. Morality is something that we do. The universe doesn't have anything to do with it. The universe doesn't care about it. It's up to us, which means that we can slide back. We can make progress, and then we can lose progress if we're not careful. The overturning of Roe v. Wade, in my mind, counts as an example of sliding back. Mm-hmm. Okay. Of course, plenty of people disagree with that. They think it's progress. But we're talking about my opinion in this case. So here, that is my opinion. And there are attempts now at reversing, of course, the progress that's been made by LGBTQ. So these things, if you're not careful, we slide back, and that is why it's a constant effort and constant battle. But I do think that there has been overall moral progress, and yes, it does take a long time.
And with that being said, do you think feelings of prejudice are innate to humans?
Yeah, which is why we need to overcome them by a willful effort. Let me give you an example. So I'm an evolutionary biologist, and even though I was working on plants when I was actually doing the thing, I've always been interested also in human evolution. And I think xenophobia, for instance, is a natural instinct. People are naturally distrustful of anybody that comes from the outside, especially if they look different from what they look. Very likely, this evolved by natural selection because it was adaptive back in the Pleistocene, 200, 300, 400,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. Because we know that for most of human history, human beings have lived in small bands of 60 to 100 individuals, most of whom were related to each other. They were each other's, uncles and nieces and brothers and sisters. That meant that if somebody were to come from the outside, probably was trouble. This was probably not a good thing. So it makes sense to me that natural selection evolved an innate response of xenophobia. But we can overcome it. We know that. I mean, there are all sorts of things that we overcome. Sometimes factually fairly easily. I mean, remember, go back to my example of getting thirsty and wanting a beer. Mm-hmm. I can override that. I can say, being thirsty is one of the strongest things, or hungry, it's one of the strongest natural feelings you can have. Much stronger than things like xenophobia, because your survival depends on it, right? But I can say, okay, this is not the time to drink, or this is not the time to eat, right? I can certainly override. I can use my mind and say, no, this is not a good thing. And so religions at their best, and philosophies of life at their best, one of the things they do is they teach us to overcome that to essentially reframe our thinking. So when I say Stoicism is a cosmopolitan philosophy, what that means is that one of the things the Stoics work toward is overcoming xenophobia, overcoming any kind of, whether it's, the fact that it's natural, which it is, it's irrelevant. There's all sorts of natural things that are bad for you. So xenophobia being one of them, which xenophobia brings also racism and that sort of stuff. Although racism, as we understand it today, it's actually a fairly recent invention. I don't think we're instinctively racist. We're instinctively xenophobic, but not racist because the very concept of race is rather recent. It's basically an invention of the last 200 or 300 years. Before that, the Greek and Romans did not look at people in terms of race. They looked at people in terms of either you're a member of my society or you're a barbarian. You're outside. Right? Barbarian literally means this comes from a Greek term, and the word barbarian comes from the fact that to the Greeks, anybody who was not speaking Greek sounded like they were saying blah 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 blah. So barbarian is simply somebody who doesn't speak Greek, essentially, for all effective purpose. And they didn't see. So, for instance, let me give you one interesting example is slavery. As I said, slavery was universal at the time, but it was actually a very different kind of slavery, based on a very different kind of concept from what we tend to discuss. We tend to think about slavery as a colonialism issue, which it is. But colonial times, remember, we're talking about, again, the last 200 or 300 years, so it's pretty recent, give or take. Racism in the colonial sense of the term comes out of a conviction that certain people are actually inferior. Remember even the U.S. Constitution initially said that black people are only 2/3 of a human being. Well, that clearly says that they didn't think that everybody was created equal, despite the fact that the preamble to the Declaration of Independence says we're all created. No, we're not. Clearly there was this understanding that people that look different from me are inferior, and therefore they deserve to be enslaved to me. In fact, they're even better off to be enslaved, because I can help them, they're not capable of living their own lives normally, so I'm going to be helpful. Very convenient, obviously, but the ancients didn't think about it that way at all. Anybody could become a slave. You became a slave because you lost a battle. So, and you were raided, and that's it. Then you were put to work by the winners. And anybody could lose a battle. Right? The Greeks lost, for instance, the Athenians lost a major battle against the Syracusans, who were also Greek, in Sicily, and 20,000 of them became slaves. The Romans lost, even though they're a very powerful empire, they lost their own battles, and when they did, Roman citizens were actually, made slaves by other people. So there wasn't this notion of inferiority. You were not inferior because you were enslaved. You just got unlucky. Right? You just lost the battle. Now, of course, once you were a slave, you can also, your children would become slaves automatically, right? But again, that was a matter of bad luck. They just happened to be born to somebody who had lost a battle. And also, slaves could be enfranchised, meaning that, in Rome especially, there was a tendency for people to give freedom to their slaves, precisely because they were considered normal human beings. And, if you work for me as a slave for 20 years or 30 years or something like that, and you are, bright and independent person, sure, at some point I'll give you the freedom. None of that is right from the point of view of morality. It was still a horrible idea, but it's very different as a concept from colonial type slavery. I think colonial type slavery is even worse, if anything, right? Because in both cases you're taking another human being and you're depriving him or her of basic rights. That's awful no matter what. But at least in the first case, in the ancient Greek and Roman case, it happened because of bad luck, as opposed to
it just involves some type of hate now, it's racism.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
So it's different, and it's been there for a long time, unfortunately.
Yeah, I wanted to ask